All right. Okay, we got everyone in the waiting room now, or pretty much everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Kara Goose, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Southeast Asia Graduate Student Program. I'm joined by my wonderful other co-chair, Anna Kostieva, who has the much better background than I. And this is the sixth part of the spring 20 to 21 Gatty lectures. And the Ronald and Janette Gatty Lecture Series is a weekly lecture series featuring advanced SEEP graduate students, as well as academics, diplomats, researchers, and others who have expertise in Southeast Asia. And today we are joined by Anthony Irwin, who is going to be on,
Tim,
on his
drive carefully.
topic. Everybody
Drive
gets this
carefully.
word. And before we get started on his bio, I'm going to introduce the format of the Gatty Lecture. With that, we're going to do about a 45-minute presentation. We ask this to be uninterrupted so we don't distract our speaker. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. If you've been to the Gatty lectures before, you're probably familiar with a chat format. But today we want to encourage actually a very open live Q&A session. So you can raise your hand and we'll call on you as you go. But if you really prefer using the chat, then you can use the chat function as you may. But again, we're really encouraging to have a live Q&A session. With that, we are going to continue. So Anthony Lovenheim Irwin is a scholar of Asian religions who thinks, talks, teaches, and writes about the social and ethical resonance of crafting, building, and construction. Dealing primarily with Buddhism in Thailand, his work focuses on the importance of craftspeople as central figures in the transmission and definition of religious traditions and communities. Following the craftspeople, artists, monks, nuns, and villagers he has been lucky enough to work with in northern Thailand, he pays special attention to the non-human and miraculous powers that participate in acts of religious building and crafting. His research has received funding from the American Council of Learned Societies, the US Fulbright Program, and the Australian National Research Council. He is taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the University of Michigan, and Siena College. And with that, I take it to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. I just want to start out by saying that when I graduated high school, I had gone to a fortune teller who told me that in about 20 years, the day after New York State legalized marijuana, I would be giving a lecture about magical swords via a video teleconferencing program on a computer. I would have given her a very big high five. If the fortune teller had then said that I'd be giving that lecture at Cornell, I would have retracted my high five because I would have thought it would have been an impossibility. So I say that to say that my being here today is the product of the labor of a lot of people, not including myself, many of them Asian and Asian Americans. And in this moment, I want to recognize the violence that has been wrought on the community of Asian Americans and say that, how can I put this? Even though I recognize the contribution to my career from Asian American people, their friendship, mentorship, and teaching, minority communities in this country should be spared violence, not because of their contribution, but merely because of their humanity. With that, I want to say thanks to the Southeast Asia program at Cornell University and the grad workers who keep it going, specifically Anna Kostieva and Kara Goose and Ava White. Also, thanks to the Society for the Humanities at Cornell and my cohort there, which has been my intellectual home for this crazy year. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully it'll work. Yeah. Like most people who encounter magical swords, I would imagine, I did not go out into the world looking for them. It was early January as my motorbike zoomed down the highway between Chiang Rai and Chiang Mai, following a set of Burma shave-style road signs stuck amongst the drying out vegetation along the shoulder. The signs, spaced about 1 kilometer or so apart, invited passersby to Chun Ruam Ngan Fang Luk Nimit Phuk Pattasi Ma Ti 12 ถึง 18 มกราคม 2557, or in English, to come participate in the collective burying of Luk Nimit and establishing Pattasi Ma from January 12th to the 18th, 2014. Oops, wrong way. The last of the signs stood at the entrance to Wat Bong Nua, a typical northern Thai village temple festooned with colorful flags and banners to mark the coming celebration. These signs announced what is one of the rarest and most significant ceremonies in the life of a Buddhist temple, the establishment of what is known as Sema space. Most temples only hold one of these ceremonies once in their existence, and for small villages like Bong Nua, it is the zenith of Buddhist activity. Sema is a Pali and Sanskrit word that simply means boundary. There are many different kinds of Sema space, but in Thailand, the area located around an ordination hall within the bounds of a Buddhist temple is a class of Sema space that is separated from any public, private, or royal claims and is completely the property of the community of monks. The small parcel of land that is consecrated is completely donated to the community of monks by the reigning ruler. In Thailand, of course, this would be the king, who through the office of the prime minister forfeits all usufructuary rights over the land. Once consecrated, this land is where important Buddhist ceremonies take place, maybe most crucially, the ordination of new monks. Sema space is ritually established in an elaborate ceremony that sees the cooperation of monastic, state, and lay involvement. The ceremony that has emerged over the 20th century in Southeast Asia looks something like this. 9 large stones, known as luk nimit, are suspended over large holes by rattan or white cotton string. The stones are ritually buried by 9 elite patrons who cut the supports with ritually produced swords. Participation in this ritual is usually secured by generous donations. Cutting the rattan is considered to be one of the most spiritually beneficial rituals in the Thai Buddhist repertoire. This is because of the classification system imposed by the National Office of Buddhism for Buddhist spaces. Only after consecrating Sema space are temples considered to be full temples, Wat in Thai. Once classified as Wat, temples are considered to be complete. This is an act of ritual construction that completes what is often a long process of temple building. To wield one of these swords that cuts the supports in this ritual, then, is believed to produce as much merit for the participant as building as an entire temple. That's a lot of merit. I had written a 200-page master's thesis on the development of Sema space specifics in the trans-regional network of Buddhist monastic and elite exchanges over the second millennium, but up to that time, I had never been to an actual Sema consecration ceremony. So when I noticed those road signs a few weeks earlier from the window of a transit van, I was ecstatic and determined to attend. I was visiting Wat Bong Nua about 10 days before the ceremony. I dismounted my motorbike in the temple parking lot and introduced myself to some of the young monks hanging around. I asked about the upcoming festival and said I would like to come and do research there. One of the young monks was tasked with bringing me around. We passed by the luk nimit suspended in a tangle of rattan over its hole at the front of the Wihan, the building slated to become the ordination hall. Once inside the Wihan, I was shocked to see hundreds of swords piled up on a platform at the center of the room, connected to a matrix of white string that linked them to the principal Buddha image. The young monk I was with started to dutifully explain to me what Sema space was. I was distracted. I already knew what he was talking about, and in my excitement, I cut him off. "What about all these swords?" I said. "Those are for the cutting the rattan that holds up the luk nimit when they are buried," he explained. "Well, I thought there were only 9, though. Why are there so many?" "At many temples, there are only 9, he continued, but here we will have about 500. In my amazement, the young monk told me that I could make a donation to the temple to obtain a sword of my own and be permitted to participate in the collective burying of the stones that marked the Sema area. I was convinced, and somewhere in our conversation, the monk explained that the swords had just been consecrated the night before in an all-night ceremony known as a Buddha Abhisek. The large Buddha image that dominated the Wihan had been reconsecrated that night, and these swords were literally tied up together in the powerful matrix and transfer of energy that activated the Buddha image. These were no longer normal swords, but were thus imbued with the same power that sacralizes Buddha images and Buddha amulets. There were a variety of sword types and lengths piled together, Most of them were sheathed in either wooden or mother-of-pearl inlaid scabbards, but there were 9 unsheathed blades set in a row of wooden stands. These, the monk explained, were for the largest donors who had given the most money and would be permitted to deal the final blow to the rattan, thereby sending the stones into their holes. These blades had the typical recess curve used in sema ceremonies I was familiar with. As I looked closer, I noticed that each sword had a piece of tape with a donor's name written on it, and beneath that, the blades were embossed with the decorative markings and sloppy-looking writing that must have been done with a jeweler's drill or a Dremel tool. I later learned that the writing was a special kata, or prayer, written by the hand of a highly achieved local monk known as Kruba Insom. Kruba Insom had written this prayer on each of the hundreds of blades on the platform and had also overseen the consecration ceremony the night before. According to Kruba Insom, this prayer transforms these swords into what are known as Dap Sari Kanchai, a class of very powerful magical swords present in the northern Thai corpus of Buddhist legends and history. But more on Dap Sari Kanchai, Kruba Insom, and his embossed kata later. Encountering this large pile of swords in this Wihan began a long process of researching the importance of ritual swords in northern Thailand, how they are made, why they are considered powerful, and how it has come to be that ceremonies that once only included 9 swords now feature hundreds, each wielded by a lay ritual participant who collectively work to achieve the establishment of that religious and political category of sema space. My presentation today is about how the political and religious power and possibilities of space is tied up with the power and possibilities of materiality, legends, communal identity, hopes for a better life, and maybe most pressingly, accessibility. Focusing on the role of what I am casually calling magical swords in northern Thailand provides insight into how objects are vessels for carrying meaning and power, but are also often functional tools with which people actively change their worlds. I understand these swords as magic in the sense that they are capable of affecting change in the world by means outside of what is typically expected from their material properties. I am not interested in extrapolating a general theory of how material is imbued with magical properties beyond the techniques and theories presented in the Northern Thai tradition. I take these swords as capable of affecting change in the world along the lines theorized by Northern Thai Buddhists. This study is about how those changes are connected to a corpus of ideas and images housed in Northern Thai texts, rituals, and casual notions. In this sense, these swords are simultaneously magical, but also utilitarian. While imbued with powers from a number of sources, the swords, in the context that I will be discussing them, are most helpfully conceived of as tools. That is, objects that are wielded in the hand and used in a manner that changes the world around and within us. With these tools in hand, Northern Thai Buddhists engage in a form of active religion, one that involves the body operating within space to collectively affect change through material and kinetic activity. Another word for the body operating within space to affect change through material and kinetic activity is building. In short, here I am showing how and why swords are crucial tools in the process of building Buddhism in the here and now for devout individuals and communities writ large. By building Buddhism, I mean that people, in collaboration with these magical swords, define, delineate, and discursively manifest Buddhist ideas, spaces, values, and relationships in the world that is immediately accessible to them. To fully grasp how and why swords afford powerful possibilities for Northern Thai Buddhists, I will examine a number of sources about magical swords from Northern Thai Buddhist history, presenting a sort of cultural biography of magical swords by looking to the realms of rituals, chronicles, rumors, art, and architecture to understand how the biographies of auspicious objects are actively constructed by Northern Thai Buddhists throughout time. First, I discuss the way these swords were distributed and wielded at Wat Bong Nua before the Sema consecration ceremony, lingering on how the swords are positioned as objects that materialize Buddhist political power and are connected to Buddhist ideas of cosmic time and rebirth. After that, I will discuss how access to this once restricted ritual object has been democratized and opened up to many people by a pair of ritual entrepreneurs, a craftsperson and a spirit medium who happen to be married to one another. Then I will explore the perceived power of these swords to the related bladed counterparts in Northern Thai understanding by reviewing a number of stories, legends, and texts that deal with swords and their connection to state power, political autonomy, and Buddhahood. I want to be very clear that some of the content I am presenting today, especially the things that come from Buddhist texts, but also some of the things that people have said to me or directed me towards, are not universally known by Northern Thai Buddhists. Instead, they are the result of my looking, of my research process, and the paths that asking certain questions has led me down. It is wrong to think that I ask the same kinds of questions as Thai Buddhists, and therefore I must emphasize that I am not presenting here a definitive treatise on why swords are important to Thai Buddhists. Rather, what I am presenting is a survey of sorts, one that attempts to show certain facets of the open and active role of swords in Northern Thai Buddhist ritual, history, literature, and playful banter. Why this is important is because it shows somewhat of a kaleidoscopic vision of how the devout experience power, repeat stories, invent traditions, and make their worlds legible, tangible, and moldable, and how they achieve these ends in concert with material objects or tools. The same day that I first visited Wat Bong Nua, the swords were moved to a table set up just outside the ritual area surrounding Wat Bong Nua's to-be-consecrated ordination hall. For the 9-day festival leading up to the Sema consecration ceremony, this table was a hotbed of action. Monks, novices, and members of the temple council took turns holding court behind the table, microphone in hand, inviting festival goers to sponsor a sword at different monetary levels, depending on the size and style. Even sponsoring one of the cheapest swords, however, secured the right to participate in the rattan cutting ceremony. Between playing carnival games, eating snacks, watching Thai boxing, participating in mass donation rituals, and drinking copious amounts of alcohol, people joined the solid line at the table to sponsor a sword. After making a cash donation, people wrote their names on printouts that corresponded to the type of sword they had sponsored and at which of the 9 lukni mit they would cut rattan. As people sponsored swords, the master of ceremonies announced their name over the microphone and extolled the virtues of participating in the ceremony, saying that Sema is the root of the religion and that cutting rattan delivers the most merit out of any Buddhist ritual because each temple only has one Phang Lukni Mit ceremony. Amidst the sound and activity, people took their swords with them as they walked back into the festival scene. At an opposing table, a group of novice monks sat with piles of paperwork, a laptop, and a printer, typing the names of the donors into a spreadsheet that was then printed out. The individual names were cut into paper strips that another group of novice monks took into the ritual area and affixed on individual strands of rattan wrapped around the metal structure supporting each lukni mit. Throughout the 9-day festival, people wandered into the ritual area to find where exactly their names had been placed, indicating the exact spot that they were to cut during the ritual. On the morning of the ceremony, Wat Bong Nua was flooded with hundreds of people dressed mostly in white. Over 400 of them, each holding their own personal rattan cutting swords. The crowd was made up of local villagers, people from Chiang Rai and Chiang Mai, and pilgrims from as far as Bangkok, who had driven all night to attend the ceremony. The sea of white-clad bodies was punctuated with bright points of orange as over 200 monks arrived piecemeal throughout the morning. I spoke with an extended family that had traveled over 800 kilometers from Samut Prakan, especially for the ceremony. This was their 3rd rattan cutting ceremony in the past 4 years, and they were determined to participate in a total of 9. They reported that it was commonly held that cutting the rattan in 9 separate Phang Lukni Mit ceremonies produces so much merit that rebirth in heaven was guaranteed. With every ceremony they attend, the members of this family obtain new rattan cutting swords. Each of these swords are kept in their home as particularly powerful objects that serve both as mementos from their pilgrimage and items of veneration. They are held to be siri mongkon, objects that bring fortune, luck, and prosperity. Specifically, the rattan cutting swords have the power to protect the home, Faoban, and prevent any type of malignant spirit or force from entering into a house that has one on its shrine. 2 safety demonstrations were held for the ritual participants, led by a smartly dressed middle-aged man. I later learned that this man was Kun Kan, the head craftsman who, along with his spirit medium wife, Kun Mao, were the producers of the hundreds of swords for this ceremony and the innovators of the mass proliferation of Sima consecration swords in northern Thailand. As the monks ate their mid-morning meal, Kun Kan held court around the Luk Nimit directly in front of the entrance to the building. Wearing a white suit with a white Bluetooth earpiece in his left ear, Kun Kan juggled a wireless mic, a sword, and a rolled up piece of paper in his hands as he gave practical instructions on when one should cut their allotted portion of rattan and how to safely hold the sword. He also took the opportunity to explain a bit of the specifics about Sima space that people might not be aware of, that the land had been given fully by the power of the king to the Sangha, and that now that it has been given, once the ceremony is complete, the land's status as consecrated Sima space would exist in perpetuity forever, until a time when it might be ritually deconsecrated. At the end of his spiel, an elderly gentleman holding 2 swords moved close to ask a clarifying question. At which point, Kun Kan clicked his mic back on and said, "This man has asked a good question. He asked if women were permitted to cut in the ceremony." Then he began to ad-lib for emphasis. "Can children cut in this ceremony? Could a pregnant woman cut in the ceremony?" Then he finally gave his answer. "There is nothing that can prevent anyone from participating. None of this would cause that word kut, which means discord, bad luck, or misfortune. There is nothing anywhere that says this one can cut and that one can't. There are no prohibitions found anywhere in the Vinaya. Anyone, man, woman, child, they can all cut. When a child cuts, then that is the barami of the child. It may one day become the barami of a Buddha." He then dispersed the crowd, asking them to please go and find their names on their designated strips of rattan. Condensed within Kun Kan's instruction and answer here are very important aspects of what makes these swords powerful: their ability to change the quality of space and the spiritual qualities of individuals over long spans of cosmic time. Theravada Buddhism presents a cosmic temporal frame that is incalculably long. People are reborn again and again into countless lives over countless eons. Kun Kan's casual explanation of Sima space existing in perpetuity is set within this temporality. Once the land has been consecrated, that status remains forever. Indeed, an important part of the Sima consecration ceremony is the deconsecration of the land of any previous Sima spaces that may have been established there in the past. This is because Sima spaces that overlap are invalid. So to be absolutely sure that the Sima space being consecrated does not overlap with any cosmically ancient Sima spaces from trillions of years ago, the land is first deconsecrated before it is consecrated anew. The second statement of Kun Kan's that works within that expansive Buddhist cosmic temporality is his statement that when a child cuts, then that is the barami of the child. It may one day become the barami of a Buddha. Barami is a spiritual quality of perfection necessary to one day become a Buddha. Barami is cultivated through various moral and ethical activities, like building temples or giving away your children to old Brahmins, but that's another story. We already heard about that family that believes that if they participate in 9 cutting ceremonies, they will be reborn in heaven. But what Kun Kan was getting at goes past that relatively short-scale benefit. Instead, Kun Kan was activating a long-span timeframe that encompasses the eventual birth of future Buddhas, well beyond the immediate future. There are many Buddhas that have come and gone in the Thai Buddhist understanding of cosmic time. The next Buddha to come is known as Maitreya, or the Pra-Arya Metai. But there will be Buddhas after him, and maybe that child who cuts today will one day be reborn as one of them. Indeed, the idea of a child with a special sword eventually being born as a Buddha in the future lines up with a number of stories in the Northern Thai Buddhist corpus of ideas that I will explore later in my talk. For now, I want to talk more about how it has come to be that Kun Kan and Kun Meo are at the forefront of Sima-based ritual innovations, which is part of my larger work that deals with how craftspeople are crucial to religion. There have been numerous arguments and clarifications concerning Vinaya laws, rulings on how the monastic community should go about proclaiming and establishing Sima space. Nowhere in the Vinaya, the laws for monks, or in any exegetical commentaries, though, are the non-monastic elements of the ceremony discussed. This provides ample room for ritual innovation to occur before and after the monastic portions of the story. Kun Kan and Kun Meo have emerged as leaders in the non-monastic makeup of the Sima consecration ceremony. They organize about 30 cutting ceremonies a year, all of which feature hundreds of swords from their workshop. This couple is so tied into the organization of these ceremonies that when I went to interview the government official who works at the National Office of Buddhism branch in Chiang Rai in charge of Sima consecration ceremonies, he provided me with a PowerPoint presentation that he shows to monks and temple councils. The PowerPoint presentation spells out all of the things that temple communities need to prepare before the ceremony, right down to how to arrange the shrine to the king by the side of the entrance of the ritual area, which holds a large portrait and the official government documents granting the temple the right to hold the ceremony. When I asked the official if he had made the PowerPoint, he said, no, I got it from this guy who makes swords, talking about Kun Kan. But Kun Kan and Kun Meo were not always at the top of Buddhist ritual organization. Kun Kan was born into a knife-making family from Lampang. He spent his early life making knives and machetes or meat for agricultural work and peddling them at markets around the country. He told me that during this time in his life, he was really a scoundrel, a drunkard whose life was a mess. He and Kun Meo married and then settled together at a market close to the Chiang Mai-Lampang border. Then, in the late 90s, he said that he and Kun Meo's lives changed. They were at their stalls in the market when some devout Buddhists came up to them. The people explained that they were sent by the highly powerful monk Kruba Wong from Lamphun to come to this market and find a man who made knives. Kun Kan and Kun Meo were surprised. They, of course, knew of this famous monk, but were themselves not especially devout. The Buddhists told them that Kruba Wong had chosen Kun Kan to make swords for an upcoming Sima consecration ceremony that he was leading. Kun Kan had never made ritual swords before, and on top of that, he was really a hard-drinking craftsperson, not really interested in getting involved with the monk. But after he and Kun Meo talked it over, they agreed to take on the work. From then on, Kun Kan and Kun Meo were Kruba Wong's designated sword makers. Kun Kan stopped drinking, and they both started keeping the 5 precepts. Their lives started to improve. They were making swords steadily for Sima consecration ceremonies run by Kruba Wong's large monastic network, and Kun Kan and Kun Meo started attending the ceremonies themselves, helping with logistics and organization. These ceremonies were the typical ones that featured only 9 swords wielded by very elite patrons. Then, in 2004, Kun Meo had a revelation at a ceremony they were involved in at a particularly poor village. Kun Meo recalls watching the cutting ceremony and thinking about how important the ritual was to Buddhists and the large amount of merit obtained by the people who get to cut. As she watched the elite patrons inside the ritual area, she began to think of her own mother and how upsetting it was that her mother, who she loved dearly, would never have the opportunity to take part in such a spiritually beneficial ceremony. Then her gaze widened, and she began to look at all of the villagers politely sitting outside the ritual space. She began to think of all the old women in the village and how they would never be able to participate in the cutting ceremony, just like her mother. I wanted to give my mother the opportunity to go and cut the lukni mit, and I also thought of other people's mothers, and I thought this, I want to give all people a chance to cut the rattan, she told me. The couple then consulted with monks about the feasibility and possibility of increasing the number of cutting patrons. Since the cutting ceremony isn't even mentioned in any Buddhist scriptures, the monks informed them that nothing prohibited this change to the ceremony. From that point, Kun Kan and Kun Meo began increasing the number of swords available at their ceremonies. While this began slowly with only between 3 to 10 swords per stone, they now run ceremonies that can feature up to 600 swords. Over the 10 years that unfolded since Kun Meo's revelation and when I first met them, the couple's work increased parabolically. They now run a huge operation of modular village-based production enterprise that they utilize to mass produce the thousands of swords they provide every year. They took me around to the villages where the various craft and production processes to make the swords are carried out. As we drove from place to place, they explained to me that over the last 5 years or so, Kun Meo has become a spirit medium for King Naresuan, the king of Ayutthaya, who ruled from 1590 to 1605 over the northern territories now in Thailand. King Naresuan is one of the historical heroes of Thailand. And as we drove around, Kun Meo took calls in the front seat from people consulting with her on life decisions. She would end the call, become silent, and then call them back, reporting what King Naresuan suggested for them. This is important because, as Kun Kan explained to me later, Kruba Wong, the monk who first got him involved in making ritual swords, had in fact been the father of King Naresuan in a former life. Therefore, Kun Meo's connection to King Naresuan tied into the work that they began doing with Kruba Wong in the late 90s. While telling me this, Kun Kan and Kun Meo also set their ability to accomplish such large-scale production in blunt materialist terms. When I asked Kun Kan why he was able to have such a leading role in the Sima consecration ceremonies around northern Thailand, he told me that it was simply because he was in possession of a large store of rattan, which was becoming more and more difficult to obtain. However they obtain their resources to make their swords, Kun Kan emphasized to me that the swords he creates are in the class of magical swords known as Dap Sarikanchai, and that he was taught how to produce these swords by Kruba Wong, the monk who first got him involved in making swords for Sima consecration ceremonies all those years ago. Kruba Wong's connection to this special class of swords may be the result of his monastic lineage, which draws back to the most famous monk from northern Thailand, Kruba Sivichai, seen here on the sword table at Wat Bong Nua. Kruba Sivichai's connection to the Dap Sarikanchai gained scholarly attention recently from Catherine Bowie, one of my beloved achans. Kruba Sivichai was said to possess the Dap Sarikanchai, this particularly powerful magical sword, which Bowie connects to his status as a millenarian figure and his political power in resistance to Siamese expansionist forces in northern Thailand during the first part of the 20th century. There is much that has been said about Kruba Sivichai, and his possession of this magical sword is only one of the many aspects of his fame. Bowie's study brings out that the Dap Sarikanchai is said by many to be the sword of Indra, and is imbued with magnificent properties and powers. When pointed at the sky, it can cause thunder and lightning. When stuck in the ground, it can cause earthquakes. When pointed at a sick person, it can cure them. And when dipped into water, it transforms the liquid into a cure-all tonic. It's a pretty cool sword. The issue of Kruba Sivichai possessing such a powerful sword comes from official charges that were leveled against him during his first trip and detention to Bangkok in 1920. The official charge, which is one of 8 brought against the powerful monk, noted a rumor that, quote, a sword with a golden scabbard fell from the sky on the altar at Pra Sivichai's Wat, and that he retained possession of this sword. Bowie uses Sivichai's possession of the sword to argue that he should be contextualized not as simply an apolitical saint, but as indicating his status within the minds of his followers as a bodhisattva for the to-be-born Maitreya Buddha. The importance of Sivichai as Maitreya is set in what she calls a, quote, millenarian social movement, quote, that fomented in the territories of northern and northeastern Thailand from the late 19th to mid 20th century. Of course, Sivichai denied being in possession of a Dap Sarikanchai, and he was ultimately cleared of the charges, which resolved that it was a rumor started by other people. Bowie situates the generation of this rumor in the economic peril that faced the people of northern Thailand in the early 20th century. Beset by famine, natural disaster, livestock decimation, increased taxation, and rise in crime, the people drew on the image of the Dap Sarikan Jai as an object of hope in the hand of their chosen charismatic saint. This magical sword was not only considered powerful because of its connection to Indra in the heavens, but also because of its connection to the potential political autonomy of the old Lanna kingdom, which has since been incorporated into northern Thailand. This connection is evidenced by the sword's presence in the corpus of northern Thai legends, texts, and art, which position the sword as a material manifestation of autonomous political might, legitimated by the logic of Buddhist kingship. One place where the Dap Sarikan Jai sword pops up in northern Thailand before Kruba Sibi Jai's rise to prominence is in the famous murals at Wat Pu Min in Nan, to which my talk now turns. The murals at Wat Pu Min in Nan are possibly the most well-known art from northern Thailand. While highly reproduced and recognized, they depict what is a very rare story, one of a previous life of the Buddha, particular to northern Thailand and Laos, known as the Katana Guman Jataka. Indeed, the murals at Wat Pu Min may be the only place that this local Jataka tale have been painted. Importantly, the murals were painted painted beginning in 1894, the very same year that a large portion of territories previously controlled by the Nan Principality were ceded to the French by the Siamese as part of a resolution of the Franco-Siamese conflict that year. Before getting into the political possibilities of the murals, though, let me quickly tell you a bit of the story. Up in the heavens, Indra, the king of the gods, noticed that the being who would one day be born as the Buddha Gautama's mother was living as a young female weaver. Indra figured this would be a perfect time for the Bodhisattva to be born on earth again, to continue the cultivation of Barami that would one day lead to his rebirth as the Buddha. Indra took the form of an elephant and trampled through this weaver woman's rice fields. The weaver chased after the elephant to spare her crop, and once the elephant was gone, she found herself exhausted and parched. She then drank the water, or urine, depending on the telling of the story, from a footprint that the elephant/Indra had left in her rice field and became pregnant with the Bodhisattva. According to contemporary understandings of this story, here is what happens next, which I take from an MA thesis on the murals by Miss Chatsuwong Geobentong from Silpakorn University. Quote, "Then she gave birth to a baby boy with a beautiful, radiant complexion, which marks the birth of a highly achieved spiritual individual. At the moment he was born, a Dap Sarikan Jai, which is a magical sword, fell down nearby. His mother then gave him the name Katana," end quote. Katana is imaged in the murals, always carrying his beautiful sword, which he notably uses to save his mother from a giant. The giant pleads for her life, gives Katana some gold and a magic vessel full of elixir, and then the story continues with Katana Guman traveling around on various adventures with his powerful sword in tow. It is important to return to the historical and political context in which this mural was painted at Wat Pu Min. The mural was commissioned by the then king of Nan, Zhao Suliapong, who hired a painter originally from Laos, Tit Buapan, to head the project. The story is an adaptation of the Sihananda Jataka that is present in Lao and northern Thai texts, but found nowhere in the central Thai region. David Wyatt, in his reading of the murals, highlights the theme of orphanhood in the story, connecting the fatherless Katana to the principality of Nan itself, which had been orphaned by the Siamese. By considering the story and the prevalence of the Dap Sarikan Jai, we can read even more pointed commentary into the king of Nan's choice to commission this story. Not only is the boy orphaned, he has his father Indra's sword. This sword can be read as representing an indigenous form of politico-religious power. While it is very possible that the story of the sword falling to earth at the moment of Katana's birth is a latter appellation, possibly grafted onto this mural from the time of Kruba Sibichai, in the present context of how the stories are told, it doesn't much matter. Now, the sword in the hand of Katana is understood to be a Dap Sarikan Jai, one and the same as the one that Bowie brings out in the Sibichai biography. It would be enough to simply say that the sword is important, powerful, and politically and religiously charged because of its connection to the god Indra and the long-span cosmic biography of the Buddha Gautama in the Katana story and the Maitreya Buddha in the Sivijai case. However, the corpus of Northern Thai texts provides even more fodder for us to analyze the importance of this sword beyond the millenarian context of Katana and Sivijai. For this, I now turn to the Chiang Mai Chronicle. The Chiang Mai Chronicle relates the legendary history of the kingdom of Lan Na from its founding by King Mang Rai in the 13th century to the resurgence of local rule in the area in the early 19th century. It was written in 1827 as a single document compiled from earlier sources and new embellishments. The Dap Sarikan Chai sword appears many times throughout the document, first as evidence of King Mang Rai and his descendants' celestial and lineal right to rule, and later as the magnificent object that is used by the Chao Jet-ton dynasty to reunify the territory in opposition to 2 centuries of Burmese rule. According to Saraswati Ongsakun, the Chao Jet-ton were of commoner background and claimed ownership of the Dap Sarikan Chai as a means of securing their legitimacy to rule. Furthermore, the spike in chronicle writing in the 19th century, of which the Chiang Mai Chronicle is a product, was a legitimating act initiated by this dynasty in order to, quote, construct a sense of heritage around itself, quote. The Dap Sarikan Chai as a palladium of Lan Na royal power may have been emphasized by the 19th century historians who compiled the chronicle from earlier sources. While it is possible that the primacy of the Dap Sarikan Chai in the Lan Na imaginaire was the product of the legitimizing campaign of the Chao Jet-ton dynasty, it is also likely that the Chao Jet-ton dynasty chose an object that was already circulating in the active mental universe of 19th century Chiang Mai. There are many specific portions of the chronicle that feature the sword, but I'm skipping them in the interest of time. If you want them, I can send them to you. The images of the Dap Sarikan Chai do not lie dormant within the text of the Chiang Mai Chronicle. Instead, these objects are active repositories of meaning in the lives of Northern Thai Buddhists. This class of swords serves as an important legitimizing implement of royal regalia for the ruling Lan Na elite of the Ping and Mekong River valleys. These objects are initially tied to the ideas of local autonomy, and this meaning has remained embedded in the Dap Sarikan Chai into the 20th century. This all seems tight and neat. The Dap Sarikan Chai that Kruba Sivijai was said to possess, and the one that Katana Goman wields on the murals at Wat Pu Min in Nan, were the swords of Indra, powerful narrative devices that embodied Lan Na autonomy. The swords afford millenarian possibilities and resistance to Bangkok rule in the north because of their connection to King Mang Rai's unification of his kingdom, and more recently, the Chao Jet-ton's expulsion of the Burmese from the area. After a few months of digging out the history and textual reference of Dap Sarikan Chai and scholarship in Northern Thai texts, I was taken up to the mountains with a couple of monks from Wat Bong Nua. We went to visit Kruba Insom, the highly achieved monk who had consecrated the rattan-cutting swords for the Sema ceremony that occurred earlier in the year. Kruba Insom is a specialist in magical swords. He consecrates swords for ceremonies all over the country, and his powers are highly sought after. He has a special Dap Sarikan Chai talismanic diagram known as a yan or yantra that he inherited from his monastic teacher, Kruba Inkam from Masuoi Chiang Rai. The yan is written in black ink on mulberry paper. It features 3 swords with different decorative hilts, each inscribed with different Northern Thai or Tuamuang prayers. I have an image of the yan, but I am not sharing it here because I do not have his permission to. When we visited the elderly monk, he sat on the floor in a prayer hall in his temple, cutting sheets of metal and embossing them with a stylus, making a form of amulet called takrut, where yan are written on a grid of the metal surface, and then the entire thing is rolled into a tight cylinder. We spent many hours with the monk as he received visitors who requested a different takrut from him for various purposes, one for luck in a new business, and another to protect a young child from harm. Eventually, the monk took time out of his task to speak with me about swords. During our interview, I began trying to show off all that I had learned about Dapsari Kanchai, that they were the swords of Indra, and that Kruba Sivichai had one. Kruba Insom was quick to cut me off. He told me that the Dapsari Kanchai weren't only the swords of Indra, but the swords of the Buddha as well. Right, I interrupted. I know that story of the Bodhisattva with the sword, and then began explaining to him the Katana Guman story from the mural at Wat Pu Min. He cut me off again and clarified that the Dapsari Kanchai that he produces are not swords of Indra or the Bodhisattva, but the Buddha Gautama and his disciples. These are the moments during fieldwork when your neat typology falls apart and you realize you are dealing with an open system of meaning making in which people engage with texts, materials, and power to change the contours of their worlds. Humbly, I politely asked Kruba Insom to explain how the Buddha and his disciples had swords. He then told me that it came from a moment during the Buddha's life when he defended his kingly patron, King Bimbisara, from the threats of a powerful neighboring king named King Jambupati. King Jambupati was threatening invasion of King Bimbisara's kingdom, but the Buddha came to the rescue. To do this, the Buddha instantaneously transformed himself into a decorated monarch, complete with a palace, crown, throne, and attendants. Kruba Insom explained that the Buddha also transformed his retinue of monks into his ministers, attendants, and armed soldiers. This episode came from the Jambupati Sutta, or the Tao Mahajampu in Thai, a lesser known, possibly apocryphal story of the conversion of King Jambupati, who, upon seeing the Buddha as monarch and his magnificent palace and attendants, abandoned his designs on Bimbisara's kingdom and became a follower of the Buddha. Most of the scholarship done on the Jambupati Sutta has been in the realm of art history to account for the elaborately decorated and bejeweled Buddha images found throughout South and Southeast Asia that gained popularity in 15th century Lan Na. In terms of art history, these images are said to possibly overlap with images of the Buddha Maitreya, who is often also imaged in royal regalia, or Song Kruang in Thai. For Kruba Insom, the Jambupati Sutta is not a story to explain art historical traces, but an actionable description of the resonant power of the Buddha and a story of efficacy that activates the prayer he uses to create his Dapsari Kanchai. When the Buddha transformed himself and his disciples into fully appointed courtiers to defend King Bimbisara, they possessed swords as part of their regalia. The Dapsari Kanchai that Kruba Insom makes are these, and his special yantra is capable of producing 3 distinct swords, that of the Buddha and his 2 main disciples, Sariput and Mokkallana. For Sima consecration swords, Kruba Insom uses the prayer for the Buddha Sarikanchai, which has special protective qualities. In the King Jambupati story conveyed by Kruba Insom, again, the importance of political autonomy flashes off the blade of the Dapsari Kanchai, which brings me to a close with the Sima consecration ceremony at Wat Bong Nea, as the nearly 500 ritual participants hacked away at the strands of rattan that held up the luk nimit above their holes. They did so with a specially consecrated Dapsari Kanchai, a material manifestation of the political autonomy of their local region. At the same time, this sword was a tool that affirmed their participation in a ritual dependent on the moral authority and territorial control of the king in Bangkok and the administrative mechanisms of the office of the prime minister. The status and power of the swords used in the Sima consecration ceremony is connected undoubtedly to the other storied blades in the Northern Thai literary, scriptural, and discursive corpus. The line that these swords themselves cut through the necessarily related realms of state power and millenarian resistance reveals how religio-political spatial realities and power are reveals how religio-spatial realities and political power and resistance are dependent on and indeed produced by the magical possibilities of objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So now we're going to open it up to open Q&A. Okay, wonderful. We have Eric White who would like to ask a question.
So thanks, Anthony. Great talk. I have an observation and a question. So my observation is, your description of this event phenomenon in which you have skilled esoteric masters, spirit mediums, and monastics collaboratively fostering innovations in ritual practice, material culture, religious ideology, I think is very widespread in Thailand and is not discussed a lot. I have encountered this myself in my studies on spirit mediums. So I think it's great that other people are zeroing in on this as well. And I hope more folks do. But I have a question, and it's a little wonky. So you talk about power, right? A lot in your presentation. But there's a lot of, so my question is about the language and ideologies that Thais use when they talk about and reference power. There's multiple linguistic markers and registers.
Sure.
We're talking about power. So Gamlang, Klang, Amnad, Saksit, Rit, Apinihan, Bunrit, Bunanupap, even Barami. So I'm wondering which linguistic markers and registers were your informants using, and were different social actors and participants using different linguistic registers when they were talking about power? And how does that map when you're talking about power? Because sometimes you're talking in a more etic, social, scientific sense, right? Rather than, say, local registers just about sacred power.
Okay, well, it's the first part, people use, I think I mentioned, they'll say Siri Mongkon, right? The object, the Siri Mongkon. They'll also use Kong Saksit, right? A sacred, what we would say is a sacred object. But they'll also say that it, like Mi Palang, it has a power, especially in its protective qualities. And I didn't go into all the things that people told me that the swords are capable of, in the way that they operate. One is, its power, its palang in its ability to literally fight and destroy ghosts. Kruba Insom told me that his Dapsari Kanchai that he makes, when you use it to slash at a P, the P will go up in like a column of flame, right? So then your question about how those linguistic registers map onto the different landscapes in which power can operate, those powers can operate, then it gets tied to things like Bun and Barami. And the power, the way I consider it is really like, in terms of temporality, Bun, and I sort of presented it like this, Bun has maybe more short-term benefits. And Barami really encompasses this long span cultivation of this quality, and the power is connected to that. And I've written elsewhere about Barami, Barami, I call it a means of production in certain regards, a lot of which I get from Kunkan, which he's and that I didn't talk about that in this talk because I've written it up elsewhere. But he literally talks about the barami that he accumulates, which is a type of power through, and Kunmeo, his wife, have accumulated through doing this, producing these swords and going to so many rituals. And that's the logic that they use also to describe and explain why Kunmeo has become a spirit medium. And so it's all tied up into realms of production, right? He has the ability to, he started, I've written about this before, but I'll just illustrate it. At a certain point, he started making these large images of kings, and he doesn't make Buddha statues, but he makes other images of historical kings, Naresuan and things like that. And at a certain point, I asked him, why didn't you make these earlier? And I thought he was going to say, well, because similar to how he said about he didn't have he has the rattan, some sort of materialist explanation. He didn't have the equipment or the tools. And he said, barami mai tung, meaning he didn't have enough barami to make these things. Because the logic is, if you don't have that level of barami and you attempt to do these things, then it causes this discord, which you can get really sick, you can die. So I see all those levels of local power, personal power, and the relationship to these larger the interface with state-based power as being related for the people who are involved in this. All right. Do I call on the people now? I can.
You can if you want to. I can give all question calling powers
don't you
to
do it, Cara? Cara, why don't
Okay.
you do it, please?
Giving me some responsibility, making me feel
Please.
important. I very appreciate it. I see your hand, Angela May, but Janette Irwin, I saw your hand raised earlier. Did you still want to ask a question, or are you okay right now? Okay.
That's my mother, ladies and gentlemen.
Aw. That's so
She wants to ask me,
sweet.
she wants to say, why are you so adorable?
That is a
And the
legitimate
reason is because of her.
Aw, that's so sweet. Okay, we all got our touch of wholesomeness today. Angela May, you may ask your question now.
Thank you. And thank you for the talk. I love learning about this, and also the additional pathways to merit making has been really interesting. And you talked about that the swords are consecrated, and it made me, especially talking about Yan, I kind of saw some resemblance to Sakyan and that consecration technique. And so I wanted to know if you were able to witness the process of consecrating a sword, or if you have any more details about that process.
Yeah, and great question. Thank you so much. I didn't witness the consecration of any swords. I got there the morning after they had been consecrated. And so those swords at Wat Bong Nua were consecrated along with the principal Buddha image and what's called a Buddha Abhisek. And that's common, that when they'll consecrate a Buddha image, which is this all-night ceremony. I don't know if you've been to one. I've been to one of those, but there were no swords present. But people will bring a lot of stuff because it's a highly powerful, Eric, a highly powerful moment where things can be imbued with this power. So those swords specifically were done there. But I want to, in terms of the Yan, what's interesting is I think I'm kind of using consecration as one event, but these swords go through multiple stages of this happening. So when Kuba Insom, when he uses his Dremel tool to write the kata on the blade, he's also saying a prayer. So that's a type of consecration. Then also, okay. Then when it goes to the Buddha Abhisek, that's a consecration. But then also its role in the cutting, the Luk Nimit, that is also a type of consecration where it's being imbued with certain types of power. So there's a lot of different levels, and it's difficult to that's why it's difficult to ask people like, well, when is it really happening, you know? And I think that question, I think about this in terms of Buddha image as well. I think that question of like, how is material imbued with this magic, what I'm calling magical power, that question I think is really important for people who come from a Western epistemological background. If we think about the history of Protestantism and things like that, that material is just this dead stuff, and that there's a moment when it becomes imbued with power. But for Thai Buddhists, that question sometimes becomes like, well, there's a lot of different stuff going on. And sometimes the material itself has its own innate power that can be brought out. And so that's especially when I'm working with craftspeople and various crafts practices, I think that a bridge that can be made is that the act of crafting itself a lot of times is bringing out the power or quality of material that we can think of as magical. I mean, even if you're knitting a sweater or something, I mean, that's also incredible. Okay, I'll stop.
Right, we have Lawrence Chua up next.
Hey, Anthony, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was a really thoughtful and inspiring and really detailed presentation. I wanted to follow up on Eric's question, but I think my question is probably even wonkier. And I'm not sure I know how to ask this, but I'm really interested in this idea that the material can be the same, but the meaning can be different, and that meaning can somehow also transform the material itself. So you towards the end of your talk, you gave this example of, or you compared the sword in the Lut Nimit ritual to the crowns that we often see on Southeast Asian Buddha images. And it strikes me that both that story of the Buddha with the sword and the Buddha with a crown are kind of these weird, irreconcilable images, right? That the Buddha is a renunciant, but he's wearing a crown. The Buddha has, he's not a violent person, but is wielding a sword. And I'm just curious how you make sense of that. Like where does that come from, and why does it persist? The sword specifically.
Well, so thanks so much, Lawrence, for that question. So to come at it first, as I've sort of asked this question a couple different ways to people, and one of the things that they say about the Buddha sword is, well, the Buddha was a prince, so the Buddha had a sword, presumably, right? So that then when the Buddha transforms himself into this great monarch to protect King Bimbisara, he does so by manifesting all of the regalia of a prince. And some people would say, oh, well, it was the sword that the Buddha had when the Buddha was a prince, or it would be some new thing. But that question of this division, I mean, and this is, what Tambaya calls the world conqueror, who's the great monarch, and then the world renouncer, who's the Buddha. And I think the way I reconcile it is just thinking about this in terms of long span time, that the world conqueror is the world renouncer eventually, that the Buddha was, that's what all the Jataka tales, where the Buddha was a king for so many lives, and then finally becomes a world renouncer. But that regalia, the royal regalia, is still part and parcel of what the Buddha's got. And that's why, so the Buddha with the crown, so in terms of what they call in Thai the images songkrung, praputa rup songkrung, meaning the Buddha in regalia, which they'll say is the Maitreya, will have a crown, but then also bejeweled, necklaces and all this elaborate stuff to indicate that this is a royal who will in the future be reborn. So, also we can think about King Ashoka, the king who really spread Buddhism around India. In the stories of King Ashoka before he converts to Buddhism, he's committing genocide all over the place, right? He's going and in the text it says he's like slaughtering all these people, right? Was the Kalingas, he completely decimates them, and he has these torture chambers. And this all comes from it comes from later texts, but that's how Ashoka is presented to us. So how do we reconcile that? So all of a sudden Ashoka converts to Buddhism, and then everything's fine and dandy. We don't have to talk about the genocide anymore. But I think it's something that's situated in the way Buddhism conceives of monarchy and is affiliated with monarchy as recognizing violence as a part of politics, I guess we can say.
So next question I have is from MK.
Hi, thanks, Cara, and thank you, Anthony. That was wonderful, and I especially appreciate all the images you were able to share in your presentation, sort of following along this ceremony and seeing all the great stuff that you're talking about. And so I'm curious how class identity and class privilege intersect with this practice, both for the lay participants, from the elite 9 to everybody else getting involved, and for the sword makers, who it seems like they went from, knife makers in the market to, these really important ritual specialists. And also the story of the woman of the couple having this revelation to democratize access to this practice, but maybe how is class still being disaggregated, because there are still the elite 9, and there are, are things truly by donation? Are there donation brackets that yield a different material that the sword is made of? So yeah, just kind of curious about how class might also be, you know, leveled but produced differently through this practice.
Great question, MK. Thank you so much. And you're pointing out, I mean, a lot of things that I didn't talk about. And class, I don't I don't know if class is being, what word did you use? Disaggregated exactly. I just think that this ritual is being opened up to a spectrum of class that was restricted to whom it was restricted in the past. And there's, okay, yeah, there's levels of donation, literal monetary levels of donation. The swords are priced at different levels based on their quality or their length or the fineries that they've got. And so, I mean, class is being reinforced in a lot of ways here, but it's, and nobody's saying that they're doing away with class by opening up the ritual, but they're giving people who were poor in the past or middle class access to this very, as they conceive of it, extremely spiritually beneficial ritual. In terms of the discourse around this practice, so, you know, there's people love talking about in Thailand, what they call Putta Panit, this Buddhist materialism. So a lot of people will say like, oh, well, that's just, you know, selling all these swords, or, you know, they'll say selling all these swords is just Putta Panit, it's just Buddhist materialism, and they're just doing it to make money, which, you know, I don't have a problem with it, but that argument a lot of times comes from people who are often educated in the West or are elite themselves, and it makes bones about people making money off of Buddhist rituals in ways that people of certain classes, villagers, don't seem to mind or have a problem with it. And I don't have a problem with it either, because I don't see it my place to talk about, you know, how much money Buddhist temples are making. That said, there's been a lot of graft, and there's a lot of there's been cases against certain temples and the National Office of Buddhism itself. I mean, the head of the National Office of Buddhism was tried and convicted of embezzlement. So about all that stuff exists within the, you know, the Thai social and legal sphere that I don't see it my job to rail on about. I guess I'll say that.
Right, so the next one I have is from John.
Yes, how's my microphone working? Can I be heard?
Yes, working well.
Okay, good. So my question is, can you talk a little bit about the spread of this, let's call it just ritual, outside of Thailand and historically, and how you understand the origins of it in Northern Thai Buddhism?
The Phang Luk Nimit ceremony?
Yeah, and the swords particularly.
Yeah, the swords, well, you know, an amazing scholar of Cambodia, Eric Davis, has written about it in the Cambodian context. And using, there they use more like, they use a large blade and they also use a cudgel, but it's still restricted to the elite to bury the Luk Nimit. And Eric, he writes beautifully about it in his book, Death Power. He talks about it in terms of the embedded power of the land and its change through this ceremony. In Burma, there's been a lot of studies of Sema consecration ceremonies. It happens in Sri Lanka. I mean, Sema is a category that exists all throughout the Buddhist world. And there's actually next year, there's a big edited volume coming out about Sema space, if you're interested, from the University of Hawaii Press. So I can direct you to look there. I will warn you that Sema is undoubtedly the nerdiest topic for Buddhist studies and gets into the most fine-grained detail of exegesis. So just be careful. This talk I gave about magic swords.
I'm probably not trying to be that sophisticated. I'm trying to understand, like, would you relate this to phenomena in Japanese and Chinese and Korean Buddhism, to
specifically the bearing of the stones? No, that's specific to Southeast Asia. But in Japan and Korea, they do have specific areas, sima areas that are consecrated in different ways. In Japan, they have a platform that they use. And there's also the bearing of the stones is only one form of sima space, even in Southeast Asia. There's sima spaces that can be made over water. And it goes back, it's present in the Buddhist scriptures, where the Buddha basically says, okay, monks, all the monks are sort of, he says, okay, monks, you've got to all come together in one area. And the monks say, well, what's an area? Sima, literally, you have to come in together into one sima. And then the monks say, like, okay, well, what's a sima? It's sort of like Talmudic. They're like, what's a sima? And then the Buddha says, okay, here's how you designate what a sima is. You find these boundaries and you say, this is the boundary for the north, this is the boundary for the south, and so on and so on. And then you've got a sima. And then it goes from there. Because the stuff in the Vinaya, the laws for monks, the laws for sima space is kind of paltry. There's not that much to it. And as Buddhism spread to places like Japan, China, Korea, Burma, people would say, the monastic community would say, like, well, how do we do this? And so then there's mounds and mounds of textual writing about how to create sima space properly. And the luk nimit, these large stones that are buried, is not included in a lot of that exegesis.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Great. Do we have any other lingering questions about sima spaces, swords,
Is there
Buddhism
any
in
in the
Northern
chat?
Thailand? You can take a look at the chat if you would like to. I'm going to take a look at it now. There seems to be some comments if you want to comment on the comments.
Then I have to read them all. This is the worst part of Zoom. Anybody who wrote something in the chat want to speak up, please, or not? I could wait
Hey,
here
Anthony,
all day.
it's Tyler here in Madison. I sort of struck by potential comparisons with or connections to, certainly not within local Northern Thai practices, but I'm thinking about Tibetan or Bon Chud practices that are inflected by Tara devotion in Himalayan styles of Buddhism, with a huge meaning of practice kind of inflected by what we're increasingly calling esoteric Buddhisms, but with ritual cutting implements and swords, in some cases crafted from human bones. And I wonder if you've maybe thought through or maybe wonder about possibility of thinking through some of those connections.
Great question, Tyler. Thanks. I in terms of the swords, I think like anybody who does study of Northern Thai Buddhism in Northern Thailand, or Burma or Northern Laos, they might toy with the idea of connections to Tibetan Buddhism, but it becomes a little bit hairy because we don't know. So I'll just say that it might be a fruitful place to go, but to be honest, I don't have the faculty to do it right, so I could just read a bunch of secondary scholarship and then make my own conclusions, but I don't think that's not the kind of scholarship I want to do, so unfortunately, it takes a lot of language learning, but maybe somebody else is more slated. I do know that now in the present day there's been especially in terms of craftspeople, there have been craftspeople going to Nepal, Tibet, in India, and coming back and incorporating certain aesthetic qualities into Thai Buddhist art and Northern Thai Buddhist art. But I'm not comfortable saying that that's what's going on with the cutting implements. But thanks.
So we have a question here in the chat, or two questions coming in.
Yeah,
So
please.
first is from Leslie, and it says, what are some interesting stories or properties about the stones and why they are buried, and are they ever unburied?
Okay, great. So interesting stories about the stones. There, I don't remember. There's some article from a while ago that connects the stones that says that they're sort of stand-ins for human heads that used to be buried when there would be human sacrifice to protect and sacralize a building. Eric Davis writes about that in the Cambodian case, where I think that that's a little bit more prevalent. The stones, I went back and read some ethnography from the 70s of somebody, I don't remember who it is, I don't have my notes in front of me, but who went to some Sema consecration ceremonies in northern Thailand. And at that time, the stones, everybody was talking about the stones in connection with the Naga, the Nag, that these were sort of offerings given to the Naga, who are these underwater serpentine deities, who also themselves produce like crystal balls and the fireballs that go up into the air. And I read this stuff and I was like, oh, interesting, great, this is awesome, the Naga. But now in northern Thailand, that discourse is completely gone. Nobody says anything about the Naga, and instead now each stone, each luknimit, is associated and indeed named after the Buddha and one of the Buddha's main disciples. So, like the luknimit that goes in the center of the ordination hall, the only one that's inside, is the Buddha luknimit, right? So, so then there's a whole thing about the name of the Buddha is there, and then there's like Sariput and Mokkallon on the sides, and there's 9 of them. So people sometimes will say, oh, I want to be cut the one that is the Buddha luknimit, because that would be the sort of most spiritually achieved one. And then people have their own names written on them. So it gets into a whole thing about the importance of people inscribing their names on things. Are the stones ever dug up? Well, this is kind of what got me on talking about Sema in the first place, which was a long time ago, when I was doing research on the beginnings of the Thammayut Reformation in Bangkok. The story is that King Mongkut Rama IV, before he was a king, was a monk from late 1820s to 1851. And he started getting obsessed with Sema space because he was a big nerd, right? And I said Sema space is the nerdiest topic. So he was reading all these exegeses, and then he went, one of the temples that he was at, Wat Ratchati Wat, which is still in Bangkok. It says in the history that he went and had the stones dug up, the Sema stones dug up, to investigate them, to be sure that they were to the sort of orthodox standards. And the reason, and then it says that he looked at the stones and said, these aren't right. So then he said, we need to do a total new, have a total new Sema space, and all the monks who have been ordained here are not real monks because they were ordained in the wrong kind of Sema space. So then he makes a Sema space on a raft on the water out on the Chowphraya River at Wat Rajati Wat. And I'll just stop talking now because I could keep talking about it a lot. But so yeah, the stones are sometimes dug up.
And we have another question from Larry, and he asks, are the swords made only by men, or can women also make them?
The swords are not made only by men. There are women who are making them. And in that, I mean, in terms of what Kun Kan and Kun Mao do, they have all these different people doing, it's modular production, right? So there may be a female blacksmith who's actually hammering out the blade and the tang, but then there's also women who are sharpening the blades. They'll be making the scabbards, the hilts, doing carvings, doing decorative work. So it's I haven't found any women who consecrate the blades or write the kata on them, however.
Anna, you can ask a question. You get to as co-host privileges.
Thank you, Cara. Anthony, I do have a question. Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. I enjoyed listening to all the details so much. And I have my own very nerdy question. So you were talking about the sword as being a symbol of resistance in a way, specific for the North Thai context. And then it is interesting that you discussed that resistance talking about very early canonical texts, and then the French episode, and then contemporary time. But I think the part I'm also interested in is, do you see any connections to the Cold War period? Because this is when North Thailand also has very particular political tensions versus Central Thailand. So does that finds any traces to what are you dealing with in terms of religious practices?
That's a great question in terms of the Cold War period. That's great because Kruba Wong, that monk who got Kunkan engaged, would be the sort of the trace back to the Cold War era, and his own. I don't think he had an obsession with swords, but his own relationship with swords. And in terms of that resistance, yeah, I don't know right off the bat about the Cold War era in terms of swords specifically. I mean, I know other things about Northern Thailand in the Cold War and its resistance and incorporation. I mean, you look at like Catherine Bowie's earlier work, and she writes all about that in terms of the Village Scout movement. I'll bring up my own question to myself that I was waiting for someone to bring it up, but January 2014 was a really politically charged moment in Thailand. When I was at this festival, this was when there were huge protests against the Yingluck government in Bangkok. There were starting to be some bombings, and people were being killed, and it leads up to the time that to the May coup, when Yingluck, who was from the north, the northerner, right, was taken out of power by what is still the ruling government. So I was waiting for somebody to ask me about that, because that's sort of the subtext in this talk, is that while this sword has been positioned as an object of resistance to Bangkok rule, while this ceremony was going on and all these Northern Thai Buddhists, many of them were pro-government supporters, were involved in this ritual that's sanctioned by the state using these swords. So it's that ritual sort of flips the direction of power that emanates out from this sword. These people would be using this sword presumably to protect the government that was in power in Bangkok at the time. What they would say now, what they would want to do with their swords, we don't know. But and so if we can compare it with the murals at Wat Pu Min, there's a lot of resistance, and Kruba Sibichai, a lot of resistance to Bangkok expansionism. At this moment when I was there in January 2014, there was a lot of support for the government in Bangkok because it was mostly supported by people from the north. I can't answer my own question though. It wasn't a question. I was just talking. It was the talk addendum.
We enjoyed your musings. We actually have like a follow-up from Larry when you were talking about the sword making. If there are defined roles, and probably asking, can you go more in detail about defined roles?
Oh, for the craftspeople?
Yes.
Or for the?
I think for like the woman and men divide, I remember from his last question.
Yeah, it would be women were doing primarily, they were doing the, I don't know. I mean, I can't extrapolate that there were defined roles. I can say what the women were doing. One, there was at one place where we went, a man was running the forge, and then a woman was running the sharpener, right? So the grinder. That the image that's the first on the talk, right, is the hand of a woman. That's a female who's sharpening the blade with the sparks flying off. There was a man at another one who was carving the scabbards, and then a woman who was there who was doing the fine, what do you call it? The fine, like, it's not weaving, macrame, I don't know what, the fine work, the decorative work, weaving stuff around the scabbards. Another one, my favorite one was, we went to one woman's house who, her job was to glue on squares of mother of pearl onto the wooden scabbards. And so she had like a goitio, like a soup stall in front of her house, just like really in the middle of the country. And she would just sit there with the soup going, and she would sit there with all the glue and glue on the mother of pearl. And then when someone would come up to buy soup, then she'd go serve them soup, and then she'd go back to her, this other kind of little little moneymaker that she was doing. So I don't know if there were, I can't say if they're defined roles. I will say that the category of craftspeople, of Chang, is very much a male gendered role. There are women who engage in making practices for sure. And Alexandra Delfara, she can talk more about this. But in terms of what Kun Khan and Kun Mao had going on, it just seemed to be like whoever was able to do just did it. And it was pretty balanced, because it wasn't just that we went to one female wood carver's house and she was carving stuff, and then another one was a male who was carving wood. So yes.
So we have time for one more question. So you can close around 2. Anthony, as I told you earlier, I have to leave for a prior commitment. So I just want to say right now, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, but I will recite the last question, and Anna, I will leave you to close today's Gatty lecture. So it's from Brian, and Brian asks, please do tell more about King Mongkut's obsession and consecration ceremony.
Okay, again, I am able, Brian. King Mongkut's obsession. Well, we think it comes from his relationship with Mon, M-O-N, the ethnically Mon monks who were in Bangkok at the time, who were descendants of refugees who had come from Burma, who in Burma, it goes all the way back to this thing called the Kalyani inscription made by this king Dhammasedi in 1467. Jake Carbine is going to have my head if I don't know the date of that. But so I'll just say the 15th century, this king Dhammasedi, who was also obsessed with Sima space, has this thing called the Kalyani inscription, which is a number of stones with an inscription written on it that says how Sima space should be established in order to be valid. The whole problem with Sima space is that it says in the Buddhist scriptures that if a monk is ordained in improperly established Sima space, then they're not a real monk. Then it's not a true ordination. So the worry then is that you've got all these monks running around, people in orange robes who actually aren't monks, and then you cut off the lineage going back to the time of the Buddha. And this is really important now in the scholarship, and also not just scholarship, but the lives of female monastics who are reintroducing female monastic lines into Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. The question of Sima space and in what Sima spaces they're ordained is very important. So back to Dhammasedi, he writes this inscription that's super detailed and references all these earlier texts and is supposed to be like this authoritative thing, right? Mongkut then, I'm pretty sure, becomes aware of this obsession with Sima space from his relationship with Mon monks in the mid-19th century. And okay, he's worried that he's not that the monks ordained in Siam at the time are not real monks. Also, he becomes a monk because his younger brother becomes the king, and there's people who say, this was typical, that you would ordain as a monk in order to show that you're not a threat to the monarch. If you are someone who's possibly could be a contender for the throne. So it's also tied up in his relationship with the palace and him asserting a type of authority using this very typically South and Southeast Asian Buddhist role of saying, well, all these monks aren't real monks because our Sima spaces aren't real. So he uses this sort of curative ritual that he gets from the Mon, that I guess they get from Buddhaghosa, but I don't know. I wrote a chapter about it, but I can't remember, so I have to go back and read my own chapter. He uses ritual called the Dalai Kama, which means the act of strengthening. So he makes a raft they call Bot Pa at Wat Rajati Wat, which establishes Sima space over water. The way to establish Sima space on land is very complicated. and there's a lot of problems with it. Water, it's pretty easy. It still gets complicated, but basically they call it uda kukepa sima in Pali, which means water cast, or like hand cast boundary. So you take your hand and you put water in your hand, and then you cast it out into the water, and as far as it can goes, then that delineates the area. So he does that. He does his active strengthening, where he takes on the Mon monastic lineage from Mon preceptors, sort of getting rid of his Siamese lineage. And then that lineage is what now we know as the Tamayut. It comes from Mongkut, getting it from the Mon. I told you this is nerdy stuff. So that's the last question. All right. I forgot to bring my sword, but I was going to unsheath it for you all, but I guess you have to wait for the next time. I want to say thanks to everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
And thank you, Anthony, for this wonderful talk. It was great pleasure hosting you today. And we invite everybody to come back next week for the next Gatty installment. Thank you.
Thanks.